photography exhibition titled Rohingya Exodus 2017 by eminent photographer Mr. Mahmoud Rahman at the Senate Building, University of Dhaka, concurrently with the International Conference. You all are welcome to visit the exhibition.
Good morning. My best wishes to the three co-conveners of this international conference, Ms. Farah Kabir, Mr. Manzoor Hassan, and Mr. Imtiaz Ahmed, the distinguished panelists of today's session. Ladies and gentlemen, the complex problem at hand necessitates the cooperation and understanding of all concerned, and that a comprehensive set of mutually reinforcing humanitarian undertakings, which must be carried out in its totality rather than selectively, is the only realistic approach towards achieving a durable solution to the problem. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not a personal observation, but an extract from a declaration that adopted the Comprehensive Plan of Action in 1989 under the aegis of the International Conference on Indo-Chinese Refugees. What I want to drive home by quoting this extract is that massive and unique as the scale is of the problem that we are faced with, a resolution to that crisis is not unprecedented in international law. And it sometimes helps to take a leaf out of history, which we hope in the course of the day today, and definitely in the course of the session today, we shall be able to. And the objective of the session will be to locate moral, legal, and political compulsions for creating an international legal regime and identifying the tools with which this may be achieved. If I may take a few minutes of your time to introduce the context against which the Comprehensive Plan of Action came about in the late 1980s, a decade and a half after the fall of Saigon in 1975, and what we may learn from that process for our present purposes. Operating within the ambit of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees and its 1967 Protocol, the CPA, as we may call it, regime was necessary to resuscitate a coherent and concerted response to the refugee crisis in Indochina at a time when interest in seeking durable solutions to the crisis had been on the wane. Clearly, compassion fatigue had set in at that time. The idea was to extract commitments to an internationally monitored political, humanitarian, and legal response while maintaining sufficient safeguards to ensure to states their continued control over admission policies which appeared to be threatened in the late 1980s by the unabated flow of asylum seekers from Indochina. A motley collection of states were brought to adhere to the principles of protection, human rights, and orderly movement under a framework of interconnected state obligations. The CPA regime therefore mandated measures to deter clandestine departures from the country of origin, basically Vietnam, but it also covered Laos and Cambodia to a certain extent, including mass media activities and regular consultations between the countries concerned, encouragement of regular departure, emigration, and immigration programs, provisions for reception and temporary refuge for new arrivals, region-wide refugee status determination procedures, resettlement undertakings for long stays and for new arrivals found to be refugees, and repatriation, voluntary repatriation of non-refugees. State responsibility was defined by the role each state played in the movement of asylum seekers. Thus, obligations as to orderly departures, measures against clandestine departures, and the successful reintegration of returnees fell on the state of origin, Vietnam, primarily. Vietnam's neighbors in the Southeast Asia region consented to grant temporary sanctuary or first asylum based on the guarantee that other states and international organizations would pursue durable solutions in the form of resettlement in a third country or repatriation to the country of origin, thereby avoiding any possibility of local integration. For the countries of resettlement, that is, developed economies of the North, which are also countries of immigration, the granting of refuge was extended only to deserving cases. Accordingly, the CPA mechanisms of orderly departure from the state of origin and status determination procedures established in the states of first asylum ensured regulated entry based on criteria that conformed both to domestic legislation as well as to international refugee law. It is thus that I set the pace for the discussions that are going to follow in this session. And with that in mind, I would like to invite the first panelist, the first speaker of the day, Ms. Taslima Yasmin, Associate Professor at the University of Dhaka, who has earned quite a reputation as an expert in refugee and migration affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Ms. Taslima Yasmin.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning to all of you, distinguished panelists. Thank you very much for having me here. Today I will be, because I am following the yesterday's sessions as well, and we are focusing more on the practitioners aspect from various aspects of refugee crisis that we are currently facing. Being into academia, the discussion that I wanted to bring in to this platform today is about a recent international law development which relates around the concept of compensation in terms of refugee context. So I will not be actually talking about or giving out a theory today, but I will be trying to review these theoretical debates that a number of international law scholars have been exercising for the past few years, especially in the context of this emerging refugee crisis. So a number of scholars are actually putting out this argument that because, for a long time, the main emphasis whenever we're addressing refugee crisis, the main focus had always been on the humanitarian aspect of it. And hence, we have been talking about the responsibilities and obligations of the refugees who have been uprooted themselves, of the host state, of the donors, of the international organizations. And in between all this, what had been overlooked is the responsibility of the country of origin for generating the refugee crisis. So what these scholars are trying to invoke is that there is the international law of state responsibility does apply in this case, and particularly in this whole context, the debate came out of the compensation, and not only compensation to the individual refugees, but also compensation to the receiving state for taking up and incurring all the expenses that have flown through the refugee influx. So in this whole discourse, one problem is that there is not much international legal statements that deal with compensation and the practicalities of, or the implications of compensation, particularly in terms of refugee context. So the earliest statement that we find is the General Assembly resolution. That's a resolution of 1948, which was done in the context of Palestinian refugees. And it stated that the compensation should be paid for the property of those refugees choosing not to return and for loss or damage to property. So this General Assembly resolution had been reiterated a couple of times afterwards as well. In 1974, the United Nations also endorsed the right of Palestinians who did wish to return to reclaim their property, reaffirming the inalienable right of Palestinians to return to their homes and property from which they have been displaced and uprooted. Again, in 1981, the General Assembly emphasized the right of those Palestinians who do not wish to return to receive adequate compensation. So apart from these General Assembly resolutions, where we do find reference of compensation to individual refugees, one more important statement that we get in terms of compensation in refugee context is in 1992 by the International Law Association's declaration, which is a non-governmental organization, and it gave a declaration of international law on compensation to refugees, a 1992 declaration, as I said, and this is basically the first document which proposed certain basic legal principles supporting the obligation to compensate refugees. So if I quote a few principles from this document. Principle one is, the whole declaration, it started with the principle that the responsibility for caring for the world's refugees rests ultimately upon the countries that directly or indirectly force their own citizens to flee and or remain abroad as refugees. Again, the principle 2 of the declaration is stating that the state that turns a person into a refugee, for the first time it's declaring that this is an internationally wrongful act, which creates the obligation to make good the wrong done. Again, principle 4 stating that a state is obligated to compensate its own nationals forced to leave their homes to the same extent as it is obligated by international law to compensate as aliens. But however, as we all know, that these are not binding laws and these are guidelines. But one more problem is that the original ILA declaration, it included, the ILA Australian Conference declaration, it included in this principle also the obligation of the state of origin to pay compensation to the host state for the expenses incurred. But that has been omitted in the final declaration that we get in 1992. Apart from all this, these are the scholars who actually support the whole theory of compensation in refugee context. As I was saying, that I'm trying to review the debate as well, and there had been contemporary scholars who does, on principle, they do agree on the justification of the principle, but at the same time, they're also trying to identify, and they do very validly find some inherent challenges and problems in this whole concept of compensation. To name one, of course, the issue that, the enforcement of compensation. Where do we enforce the compensation claims? What should be, which country should have the jurisdiction? What should be the forum? Although this also had been addressed to a certain extent by a number of scholars, for example, Professor Lee, and also in the ILA declaration, we do find indication of certain propositions to actually find how to enforce compensation. For example, the ILA principle is saying that, it's talking about tying up the obligation of the state of origin with the fact that, the aid assistance, the economic and humanitarian assistance should be tied up, should be dependent upon their compliance with the claim of compensation. And again, UNHCR, the principle is proposing UNHCR of having a guardian role in terms of, administering these claims of compensation. But again, as some of the authors are also saying, that these are very hypothetical solutions, and there are bigger problems as well to this. One such very important note that especially Professor Garvey, he suggested is the fact that, the right of emigration, this whole debate or this whole discourse on enforcement of compensation might have a prejudicial effect also on the right of emigration of the refugees. To suggest the state might just want to, contain the refugees from the area of persecution, and they would not let them flee out of the area of persecution. So they are suspecting a fear of getting the right of emigration, which is a fundamental norm of human rights, being affected by this whole jurisprudence of enforcement of compensation. And lastly, again, the fundamental question that is there is, about if we really have an enforcement of compensation mechanism, how far this is going to address the root cause of the problem, whether it would at all be changing anything, or it would just be reinforcing the status quo of injustice, whether it is possible by a mechanism of compensation to address the deep-rooted social causes, the deep-rooted political causes that create the refugee flow. So with that question, I would like to end my discussion here, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
It's interesting that Professor Yasmin draws on that basic tension in international law between, in regime creation, that there's this classic tension between normative strength and procedural weakness. The normative strength, I think, proceeds from the core principle in international law that in any areas of international activity, distinct roles are assigned and obligations assumed by states concerned with an issue, whether they are the source of a problem or a state affected by the consequences thereof. And seminal work has been done under the aegis of various international law commissions and authority cited by Professor Yasmin. But there's also one work on which lawyers and activists who sort of dabble in refugee law rely on, is the work that has been done since 1978, actually, by the International Law Commission in enunciating broad principles of state responsibility with regard to international liability for injurious consequences arising out of acts not prohibited by international law. Somewhat an ambulatory route has been taken by jurists and enthusiasts in international refugee law and protection measures to rely on the findings of the Commission in this regard and identify and locate a primary responsibility to cooperate in a manner that prevents emigration, prevents egregious abuses of human rights within one's territories, and if that happens, then to assume responsibility on various levels on the international plane to extend support to an affected state and affected individual, one avenue of which is reparation, which has been elaborated on by Ms. Yasmin. Without further ado, I would like to hand over the podium to our next speaker, Ms. Jessica Olney, who is a program director and a founding member of Center for Social Integrity, an organization that works closely with the Rohingya community in Yangon and the northern Rakhine state in Myanmar and Cox's Bazar here in Bangladesh. Ms. Olney, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning. The speaker preceding me has referred to opportunities and challenges in the law, and I would like to explain the way that CSI and civil society networks are attempting to complement that work that's happening amongst international advocacy experts, and the way that we are trying to look at ways to fill kind of the space on the ground in the meantime. So what we're looking at in Center for Social Integrity is how can we uplift the community, how can we strengthen civil society and strengthen community leadership for future reconciliation, future repatriation, future justice. I think the communities we work with recognize that instantaneous justice and accountability are not forthcoming in the very short term, that this is a long-term process. And in the meantime, they have many requests around perhaps more quickly achievable advocacy points, as well as responses that could be enacted at the community level in Yangon, in northern Rakhine State, and in Cox's Bazar. So I'm coming as a representative of CSI. CSI is a nonprofit, non-government, nonpartisan, global civil society organization. And we work in the areas of peace, protection, humanitarian response, and education. And CSI was founded by a Rohingya humanitarian professional, and our board is comprised of diverse young professionals from northern Rakhine State who had extensive humanitarian experience but wanted to apply that operational capability and the networks that they had established through that work to a civil society focused organization. So because of travel restrictions, our Rohingya leadership is not able to be here easily. So I'm representing them, and in preparation for this talk, I've consulted their feedback. We aim to amplify the community's voice, and so we frequently conduct focus groups with hundreds of community stakeholders by phone with our Northern Rakhine teams in Yangon, amongst the Rohingya communities of Yangon, and in Cox's Bazar in the camps. So hopefully what I will share with you today is a reflection of feedback that's been directly raised by the community, including some advocacy points for the situation in Northern Rakhine, and also, moreover, for the humanitarian response here in Bangladesh. So just a little bit more about CSI. We send aid to conflict-affected civilian populations in northern Rakhine, and we get a lot of information because of that to understand in a more granular and nuanced way what's happening in different village tracts and village levels. And what we want to emphasize is that it's not the same in each place. And so I think there's more academic research that's needed to really look to see why dynamics are different in different places and to understand different dynamics. Because if we can look at places where some element of social cohesion has been maintained and where communities are still living peacefully together, we might be able to find some factors that perhaps could be replicated or reintroduced into places where that social cohesion has been broken down and where displacement is higher. So in the long run, we would hope to do a more rigorous analysis to see how we could identify these mitigation factors and perhaps reintroduce them as part of a longer-term community reconciliation and rehabilitation effort. We receive letters, actually, from diverse communities that are remaining in northern Rakhine. Last week, we received a letter from a Rohingya and Rakhine leader of the same village, saying, we still want to live peacefully together, we don't want conflict, can you help us with community reconciliation? So now the question we're asking ourselves is, are there pieces of that that could help to resolve this crisis at the local level, along with the international response? Or is the state-sponsored violence so overwhelming that the community's own will for peace and reconciliation might actually not be that relevant? So we need more research to understand better what's happening in those different places. Along those lines, one of the main advocacy points that the Rohingya community members remaining in northern Rakhine have been raising with us is around the need for a roadmap to peace. So can we break down this greater need for accountability and resolving the crisis and find more of a step-by-step roadmap? So one of our focus of inquiry, as I mentioned, is trying to identify what can be done to strengthen the community in the meantime while this international longer-term conversation is taking place. So a possibly more achievable step is to call for an immediate moratorium on the national verification process. So this seems to be a detail that has been glazed over a bit in the international coverage of the conflict. So the NVC process ostensibly creates a pathway towards citizenship for Rohingya in northern Rakhine, but what we see in practice is that it serves to strip more than 95% of the applicants of their last citizenship rights. So we estimate that around 7,200 people, still a very small number, have applied for the MVC process, with the hope that eventually they would get a card, an ID card out of that. And we've seen that only around 200 have received it. So of those 200, it's not because they passed a rigorous test to prove their citizenship more than the others. It's because of being able to pay bribes, usually, to the immigration department. So we can see very clearly that that process is not reliable, that it's a broken process. And we'd like to call for an immediate moratorium to it and just stop that. Not only because the process itself is problematic, but also because it's a driver of ongoing intimidation where security forces continue to visit families door to door and press them to accept the card. And so that fear, that intimidation creates a push factor that's ongoing as of now. So we just want to raise awareness. We might not be able to achieve full justice and accountability right now, but perhaps we could pressure for a moratorium on the MVC process. And as a step towards reducing militarization day to day in some of the remaining communities who are trying not to flee. So that's northern Rakhine, and then our volunteer networks in the camps have also raised different points with us. We have 100 full-time volunteers who are mostly educated youth living in the camps. A lot of them were teachers, humanitarian professionals, health workers, civil servants in Myanmar. And many of them were university students whose own educational development was disrupted by the conflict. So we believe that by empowering those volunteers, we can start to bolster influential networks of civil society and secular leadership. So of course that's important for any community, to have people who are equipped to vision the future. And so we're trying to invest a lot in bolstering their skills. So they're working on things like direct protection, monitoring case referrals, bringing vulnerable people to health clinics to seek services, and also emergency preparedness in advance of the monsoon and landslide. So they're helping vulnerable families relocate. So this need to uplift human dignity, we believe, is a core need that immediately follows basic survival. And there's a lot we can do within the camp setting to bolster that human dignity. And that's what camp residents are really looking for. And so they tell us, you know, we don't want to be dependent on aid. We don't want to have to rely on Bangladesh. And they unanimously tell us how grateful they are for the protection that's been provided, of course. And they continue to be very supportive of the Bangladesh Army by and large. But they say, you know, our immediate protection and immediate survival is not enough. We need education. They see children as the future leaders of their communities, and they're very anxious for them to resume their education. So they feel a bit offended that there seems to be an impression internationally that Rohingya are all illiterate or there are no intellectuals in the camps. There are quite a few. They might not, you know, be the majority because so many people have lacked education due to discrimination. But they're very eager for their children to have a chance to study and develop more capacity than they were able to in Northern Rakhine. And they still believe in earnest that if that educational capacity is there, perhaps, you know, there'll be a better likelihood of future resolution to the conflict because their own participation is needed. And currently the Rohingya, they have no voice at the table in humanitarian decision making. They can't travel to Cox's Bazar for meetings. So you have a strong presence of Bangladeshi NGOs that's provided a localization of the response, which is very helpful, but it's not a replacement for involving the refugee community themselves in that humanitarian decision making. So they would like to be consulted more, they would like a stronger voice, and they believe that this is actually important for preventing any violence or hopelessness that could happen in the camps as well. So they want to be included and feel like their voice is being amplified. So these are points that the community asked me to raise, as I said. So hopefully they're not my points, hopefully they're the community's points. But they, you know, so education is a big one, and then another thing is livelihood. They would like a chance to be able to earn a small income because the food rations they receive, it's only 4 items. It's not sufficient for survival. So they have to find a way then to sell some of the rations in order to buy vegetables or basic nutrition items. They can't actually survive on what they receive as a ration. So they've also asked us to raise awareness of the need for them to meet, you know, their basic nutrition requirements. Because if they're not able to earn a small income to buy basic food, then they're forced into an informal economy, which creates additional protection risks for them. They're also requesting more support for women's empowerment, and our volunteers, some are teaching Burmese and English literacy classes to women and seeing women as potential participants in the resolution of the crisis. A lot of people also need psychosocial support to overcome the trauma they've suffered, so they want support to have community-based groups for women's resilience. And then finally, one other point that we were asked to raise is the need for ethnographic research. So they want more support to help clarify and uplift Rohingya cultural, linguistic, and anthropological uniqueness, and be able to clearly explain how Rohingya culture is distinct from neighboring communities. And there are singers, poets, storytellers, artists in the camp who want to help with that and want to, you know, show their culture, not in a nationalistic way, but in a prideful way. And they risk losing their culture entirely. So they're seeking more support on that. And these are things that they've identified as second only to basic survival. So CSI as an organization and our partners are looking at how we can uplift these elements for the community and help them kind of develop and identify key areas, both in terms of advocacy and in terms of cultural strengthening and community leadership. So that's a brief summary. Okay, thank you.
I find it so gratifying to have heard that present. I think that needs to be switched off. Thank you so much. It's so gratifying to hear that presentation because it focuses primarily on that most ideal and preferred of all durable solutions, that is voluntary repatriation by ensuring voluntary repatriation in safety and dignity. And Ms. Olney has given us certain pathways of empowerment to make that solution sustainable. And it is a presentation of hope. And who better than Ms. Olney and CSI who work across two jurisdictions in Burma and in Bangladesh to give us an overview of these linkages that we must build on to make that most ideal of durable solutions, voluntary repatriation, the most sustainable and the preferred one. Thank you, Ms. Olney. It is a real pleasure now to introduce the next speaker, Mr. Tapan Bose, who is the Secretary General of South Asia Forum for Human Rights. And it's a very personal view that, you know, his contribution and significance lies in opening up avenues of dialogue across the very fractious South Asia tapestry of political and ethnic identities, and to find a middle ground, as it were, in that context. And he brings to fore, I think, anticipating what he may have to say, he brings to fore the element of realpolitik, as it were, in this whole debate of how feasibly we may forge an international legal regime for a durable solution to the crisis. As eager as I am to hear Mr. Bose speak, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. Bose.
Thank you, Justice Zafar. I hope I will stand up to your expectations. I don't need to go into the details of the crisis or the tragedy, or whatever we want to call it. By simple words, I would call it a continuing genocide, as many of us done since the last 10 years, a slow burning genocide. But however, we are in the world of realpolitics, and the Genocide Convention is trapped in that politics. Nobody actually wants to activate it, particularly the Western countries. Similarly, before I go into, I have worked on the refugee issue in this region for, I think, more than 3 decades. And I think one of the weakest UN convention is the Refugee Convention. Conceived at the end of the Second World War, was primarily to deal with the refugees or the displaced persons on mainland Europe. It didn't have anything for people outside that region. And if you look at the definition of the refugee in the convention in the olden days, whether it was the International Refugee Organization or the UNHCR that came into later days, it is very, very Eurocentric. We in the subcontinent know in 1947, 7 million people were displaced. Under that refugee convention, the 7 million of people who were displaced during the partition were not refugees. So this Eurocentricity of the convention has remained. And on the other hand, what is the, if you look at which is the world, part of the world which houses the largest number of refugees, it's the global south. We create refugees and we house them. Look at Africa, look at Asia, look at the West Asia. Every country hosts refugees. People are moving across for years, decades. Look at the Palestinian refugee problem. And Palestinians were also taken out of the care of the UNHCR. For that, the European and the United Nations created another mechanism. These are, I'm just laying down, is the kind of politics that controls the humanitarian regimes of the United Nations. And it continues till date. And if you look at the weakness, the core weakness which I've always felt of the Refugee Convention is that there is nothing, under this convention, there is nothing we can do to the refugee creating country. And there has been debate, I remember in the 90s, and we were part of it, we went everywhere, we went to Geneva, we went to Oxford, we were debating the need for reconceptualization of the Refugee Convention. And finally, what we came away with, when the Fortress Europe was closing its doors to refugees, then we said, let's not push for it, because if we do now, they will dilute it so much, and nothing will be left of this convention. Yeah. So this is what is the grim reality of the international situation today. I would say that the protracted Rohingya crisis and the let's say cycle of the arrival since the last 2 years is not, should not be seen in isolation. We need to place it in the geopolitical context of the region and the way it has been handled, and how do we find what is going on. Now, if you remember, immediately after the crisis broke out in August, September, USA, particularly Nikki Haley, if I remember correctly, the US ambassador to the UN, stood up and said, used very strong words. He said, time for good words and, is gone. Now we must take action against the culprits in Myanmar. Nothing has happened after that. USA threatened to use sanctions against the military officials, is still not come through. The United Kingdom, which has been providing military training to the Myanmar army, I am not sure that it has suspended it as yet. Now, it's interesting that when the United States was criticizing Myanmar government, the strategic partner of the United States, India, went ahead and our Prime Minister, my country's Prime Minister, visited Myanmar in September and used almost similar words that the Chinese had used in supporting the Myanmar government, that they were stabilizing, thanking them for stabilizing the situation in Rakhine and taking prompt action against terrorists. If you look at the narrative of the Indian Prime Minister, is very much a part of the dominant US narrative of global terror. And it's a question to be asked that when USA and the West has taken such, at least openly or in public forums, a position that condemns the Myanmar government and its military leaders, and we have also condemned Aung San Suu Kyi for her silence and almost tacit support to the army. Why is it that India, which has been known for being generous to refugees all through these years, has suddenly turned around and is in fact, or are they doing it only because they are worried that China will make inroads? So this elephant in the room, China, which has suddenly become the most important factor in dealing with the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, needs to be looked at, and we need to also try and understand who or what is the real threat that China is representing and who's threatened, and where does India stand with those who feel threatened by the rising power of China in the world today. And again, it brings India and the US together in this game. So, I mean, that's the thought I want to leave here. See, let's sort of look back into what was happening. When the sanctions were imposed on the Myanmar government by Japan, USA, and the Western countries, China had moved in with trade, with military aid, with money, and of course benefiting from. The Chinese became powerful, and we can see that there was slowly and gradually, though the military rulers were very happy and well looked after by the Chinese, they were feeling constrained and constricted by the influence of China. So in 2010, when they talked about opening up, it was not because of their love for democracy and sudden realization that we need to give something to the poor people. It was to create a bigger and a larger space for them. So what they came up with the so-called reform, which they learned from 1980 and 88. They did not want to commit the same mistake. So they retained all the powers in their hand and gave a facade of democracy, a fig leaf, which the West was waiting for. And we all rushed in. We saw them rushing in. And Obama landed up in 2012. Doors were opened up. Things were moving forward for everyone. All the oil companies and others who were stopped from doing their operations in Myanmar are now back there, and good business was beginning. And now this has happened. And now that it has happened, and we see why in Rakhine. Rakhine is a place where the Chinese have been very majorly involved. Nearly $8 billion they have already invested, and there is a lot more to come. India lost out the offshore gas field, and the Chinese got it. They have set up the port in Sittwe, which is strategically and from business point of view, is a very, very important area. And it's something that both the West is particularly Americans are very unhappy with, because they see it as a strategic threat. And the Chinese having a port, control of port in Sittwe, in Hambantota down there in Indian Ocean, and in Gwadar on the Arabian Sea, is a matter of serious concern. So there is, and then the Chinese also were setting up a huge industrial zone in Rakhine, gas pipeline, so on and so forth. So Rakhine certainly is an area of great economic and strategic interest to China. So if the area gets massively destabilized, who benefits and who loses? The Rohingyas lose. They are just pawns in the game. The question that we need to ask, and I'm asking myself more than anything else, that what is the real will of the international community? And will they really be benefiting from bringing stability, peace, tranquility into this region? Or there will be more to benefit from a destabilized, conflict-prone, war economy? That's a question I leave to my friends who know more about all this and economics. I don't understand much about war economy. Whatever little I've read, I think if you look at the history and I'm a student more of history than of economics, war economy has always been beneficial to the warlords. and manufacturers of war machines. And we know who they are. So, now in this, I want to come back, leave the Western world, I want to come back and look closer at what's happening in our region. The misfortune is that in India, which is the largest country of this region, we have a government led by a very radical, right-wing Hindu nationalist party. And it is committedly anti-Muslim. And this links with, in many ways, what they are doing. It's not just, I think, only the economic reasons, it is also their ideological and political motivation, which is at play in this. And that is fairly well exposed when suddenly out of the blue, Government of India decided that it must deport the 40-odd thousand Rohingyas who have been living in India since 2010. And mind you, as I said, India has historically, though it is not a signatory or ratification of the UN Convention or its additional protocol, it has been very generous to refugees. And the Indian courts have extended the protection to refugees in many ways by interpreting the Indian Constitution, that the Indian Constitution's Fundamental Rights chapter does not use the word citizen, it used the word person. And a person is citizen, non-citizen, doesn't matter. So all persons on the soil of India have a right to life, right to equality, freedom of expression, etc., etc. And therefore, that was extended to ensure that refugees who are there, their right to life is protected. And we've been to court many times and won several cases against this deportation. Now suddenly, we find this government, the Home Minister, saying that we are not a signatory to the UN Convention, we don't care, they are a threat. Now what is this threat? So 40,000 Rohingyas have become a threat to India's national security. And that's the case that we are fighting in the Supreme Court of India, to which I am a party, where the government has said that they are a potential threat, mind you the word, potential threat, to India's national security. There is no evidence. Till date, we are third month in the court, government has produced a single case which shows that a Rohingya refugee was involved in any kind of terrorist activity and was arrested for it, or there is a charge sheet. They have been held for petty crimes, this, that, and other things, but nothing to link them with any kind of terrorist or anti-India activity. So what's the reason? The reason is simple. They are Muslims. And Government of India is also trying to change our citizenship law, which will give automatic citizenship to persecuted minorities belonging to Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist religion from the neighborhood, but not to Muslims. They will change the constitution character altogether because ours is based on equality. Let's see how the Supreme Court deals with it later. That's one aspect of India's response. But the question that needs to be asked again is that what about India-Bangladesh relationship? India-Bangladesh relationship, as we know, has not been very good. But of late, it has been improving. Hasina ji's government has given India for the first time many of the things that the Indian government has been asking for. Transit, port facilities, many of the other things. And for that, Hasina ji has been criticized by her opposition as pro-India. Now that India has forsaken Bangladesh on the Rohingya in Bangladesh's moment of crisis, now that India has decided that it will not accept or do anything about Bangladesh's request that there should be an international independent inquiry commission. They virtually rejected it. What impact it will have on the internal politics of Bangladesh and India-Bangladesh relationship. Now, if India is looking for security and stability in this region, was it a well thought out decision, or it was a decision taken for other reasons? I would think it is taken for other reasons. It's taken primarily under the pressure of the United States. The United States' singular objective in this region, to stop the Belt Road Initiative, to stop the ingress that China is making, and even now that they're forced, the Western countries are forced to criticize the Myanmar government, and China has to be stopped because China is now again massively pushing forward in Burma, because it's the only country which is really supporting them right now. So who's the cat's paw for the West? It's India. And that's my opinion. I may be wrong, but that's the way I look at it. So this is the kind of a situation. I'm sorry, I'm not painting a very, very bright picture or a hopeful picture. But I'm saying all this because I think we need to be a little more aware of the larger issues. What are the implications of this? The implications of this is, I think, is very bad. Let's look at the metrics of this region. We are multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic countries. It has taken post-colonial states of this region a lot of efforts to create stable political arrangements between the ethnicities, including Southeast Asia, if you look at it. And we are still struggling. In Bangladesh, the ethnic problem is not settled. We are still there. In India, it is exploding everywhere. In Burma, it's very far away from coming to any conclusion. Malaysia froze it by creating absolute frozen ethnic categories. The Singapore, it's a small city-state we needn't talk about. Indonesia also has ethnic problems. These are all at the moment sort of under the... Now, if the Rohingya, let's look at it, we're looking at 1.2 million people raped, tortured, violated, and abandoned. And this is more powerful than a nuclear bomb, as I say. And though Hasina government has been very good, it has stopped, did everything to keep quote-unquote Islamic fundamentalist organizations out of the camps. The 3 organizations he has already banned. But how long? How long can we expect these people? And Rohingyas historically, if we look at them, is one of the perhaps most peaceful people in the world. I've met them, I've talked to them, I've been dealing with them since the 90s. Rohingyas, in fact, internally, they do not support, they hate talk of violence within their community. But this will change. It's not going to remain. And once that happens, these will become hotbeds. There's no way this November agreement is going to be implemented. I have seen my own experience with a similar process that the Bhutanese government had started about identification of the Bhutanese refugees who were pushed into Nepal. It collapsed after 8 years. And the only way we could resolve, because there were only about 1.2 lakh of people, 120,000, 80,000 was finally taken away by the USA, and the rest went to Canada and all that. All of them went to third country settlement. 1.2 million Rohingyas, nobody is going to take. Let's look at the figures. The largest Muslim country in the region, Indonesia, has only 1,000. And Indonesia has been one of the worst, treatment of the Rohingya boat people. Malaysia is talking generous today, but if you go there and see the condition in which the Rohingya refugees live there, you'll realize how generous they have been. And Malaysia, these people work as slave labor. They live in, a camp with 3 or 4 sort of bunk beds. So these are countries which are politically not very settled and not fragile. I mean, still very fragile, their integrity. If the Rohingya issue is not settled, it is not the West who's going to suffer. It's the Rohingyas, of course, are suffering, but it is going to make direct political impact on the stability of the whole region. Now, is that the coming war? I don't know. Is this the new arena that the West is looking at to open up? Possible, because the way we look at it, the whole effort today, or what is now being called the coming war with China, this region becomes a very important area, if that's the kind of a game plan. And in that, what Imtiaz began by his presentation by saying, why the timing? Why is it that immediately after Kofi Annan's report, we had this incident? The timing is critical. And also, the last thing I want to go, before I go away, I want to question, we'll never know what really had happened. Now, there is a claim by the Myanmar government that 13 police stations were attacked. This is a tremendous military operation, to coordinated attack on one day on 13 dispersed police stations straight across the border. I have looked at the Hezbollah's achievements, even they haven't been able to do it. I don't know how ARSA did it and who helped them. And what is the real truth about it? So unless we have an inquiry, we will never get it. So my concluding appeal to everyone is that we need to ask our own governments to look beyond this immediate crisis and the way they are responding. That's what we are trying to make Government of India understand, that it is not in the larger enlightened interest of South Asian region and the state of India to behave in the way we are doing Myanmar, because China is making inroads. There is no way India will be able to match China's influence there. That's very, very, very clear. So it has to be another way, and the humanitarian path is the only path. And here, I think what Bangladesh could initiate is a dialogue forum with China, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and India. Let's take a regional responsibility of this. Let us try to get India and China with Bangladesh on the same board to see what needs to be done in order to create keeping in mind that there is a need for a protected homeland of the Rohingya in the region. And that can only happen not under the UN pressure, but maybe if all these 4 get together and impress upon Myanmar government. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, as anticipated, Mr. Tapan Bose has really thrown down the gauntlet. And now it's for us to best understand how we pick it up and what the way forward is. At the very beginning of his presentation, he spoke of the slow-burning genocide that's unraveling, or has unraveled, across the border. He picked on the very pertinent issue of the weak legal regime that has evolved under the 1951 Convention. And its weakness is most apparent in its inability to hold the country of origin or the refugee-creating country to account. It would suffice, and that's where I would like to begin in making my closing remarks. It would suffice to state here that the 1951 Convention, like most post-World War II multilateral exercises, reflect a moral condemnation of the abuses associated with World War II. And we can find in the numerous exercises since the end of World War II a legal elaboration of substantive norms in different issue areas under the broad umbrella of human rights that reflect a continuous moral demand, at least, for human rights regulation and prevention of abuses of human rights. That, I think, we can all be agreed upon. Accordingly, in every condemnation of human rights abuses in the existing international setting, we can find an implicit, submerged, or deflected expression of a sense of moral interdependence. And that is what binds all of us, that concept of moral interdependence. And that's why we are congregating here under the aegis of this conference. This moral demand notwithstanding, and this is something that Professor Yasmin touched upon, this moral demand notwithstanding, procedural weaknesses as highlighted by Mr. Bose, in implementing and enforcing the substantive norms are in evidence of the fact that existing human rights regimes are political creations, and that to be of any consequence, there must, in the ultimate analysis, be a political acceptance of the creation of international legal regimes. Because every international legal regime in the area of human rights involves that element of giving up or ceding a part of a state's sovereignty to be regulated consequentially by international norms that directly impact upon a municipal regime's perception of human rights management within its territorial boundaries. The result is that regimes, all human rights regimes, have normative strength, but procedural weaknesses. And this is the challenge that this conference has to face. And this is the challenge that this conference must pose to the international community. How to bridge that gap between normative strength and procedural weakness. We have to find a way, maybe this is the first step, but the ultimate objective will be to find a way where we can go beyond merely endorsing, notification, consultation, exchange of information, promotion, and weak monitoring of international guidelines. That, I think, is the underlying legal thesis of what Mr. Bose was trying to impress upon us. Is there an answer now? Do we have an answer at hand? We can only grapple at some of the tools that are now available under international law, and I would just want to sensitize you on those aspects. They do not provide answers, but they do provide us with tools that we can work on. And I find heart, in particular, in the emerging international legal norm that has come to be known as the responsibility to protect, or in brief, R2p. This concept that has emerged since the early 2000s recognizes an obligation of states and the international community to protect potential victims from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity through a broad spectrum of preventive, responsive, and rehabilitative measures that have yet to be identified. Well, I will come at the end of my presentation to one such effort where, an identification process has happily taken place. The R2p concept builds on the basic premise that sovereign states have a responsibility to protect their own citizens from avoidable catastrophe. But then when they are unwilling or unable to do so, which corresponds to the scenario across the border in Myanmar, I think we are all in agreement about that. That responsibility must be borne by the broader community of states. That's where we, Bangladesh, comes in, and the global community as a whole. What happens, therefore, under this R2p umbrella is a shifting of the responsibility to protect from the country of origin, the country of citizenship or country of residence, to the international community. And at the same time, it bears a condemnation, it reflects a condemnation of the fact and a realization of the fact that sovereignty no longer translates into a license to violate individual human rights. Are we, in the realm of refugee protection, any close to incorporating that sense of collective, concerted responsibility on the international plane? I would refer in this regard to a very recent initiative that I think purports to transfer or incorporate the R2p element in the refugee protection debate narrative. And this I see happening in the New York Declaration and Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, adopted by the General Assembly on 19th of September 2016, representing a set of commitments to enhance the protection of refugees and migrants. Of particular relevance to us is the fact that the New York Declaration, as we may call it, sets out the elements of a comprehensive refugee response framework, which we can call CRRF, to be applied to large-scale movements of refugees and protracted refugee situations, thereby potentially being attracted to a situation that we are now faced with in Bangladesh. The key objectives of the CRRF are to ease pressures on host countries like Bangladesh, and enhance refugee self-reliance. And this is, I'm so happy that Ms. Jessica Olney, this is what I think your presentation was all about. And I'll come back to another significant aspect of your presentation a little later. Self-reliance is a dominant factor. The refugees themselves, the communities themselves. The CRRF also speaks of expanding third country solutions, something that I think needs to be debated aggressively in this context. This is something that has not come up as substantively as ought to have over the last 6-7 months since August 2017. Third country resettlement solutions. And the third element being support conditions in countries of origin, again coming back to Ms. Olney's presentation, for return in safety and dignity. And my happiness, for want of a better word, is that I see in this 2016 initiative at sort of establishing the CRRF guidelines, the fact that someone has borrowed from a leaf in history from the Comprehensive Plan of Action of the 1980s that I referred to at the very beginning of this morning's session. We are revisiting history, and someone is following an historical precedent. And for a lawyer and a judge, I always like the fact that someone can back up one's arguments and actions by following a legal precedent. And someone, in drafting the New York Declaration, thought of that. In Article 68 of the Declaration, there is the idea mooted of the centrality of international cooperation to the refugee protection regime, and recognizing that the burden that large movement of refugees place on national resources of a country of asylum, especially in developing countries like Bangladesh, there has to be extracted from the international community a commitment to a more equitable sharing of the burden. The concept of burden sharing has come in, which was also central and focal to the CPA in the 1980s when we were dealing with a protracted Indo-Chinese crisis, refugee crisis. It has crept into the international law debate narrative again, happily. A more equitable sharing of the burden and responsibility for hosting and supporting the world's refugees. In Article 69, the responsibility is given squarely to the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, to work in close coordination with relevant states, including host countries, and involving other UN entities, with a view to building up a multi-stakeholder approach that includes national and local authorities, international organizations, international financial institutions, civil society partners, private sector, and the media, and the refugees themselves. Again, something that was stressed upon so significantly by Ms. Olney. That, I think, ladies and gentlemen, is the way forward. We are all agreed on the fact that this is a protracted exercise. We are all agreed on the fact that we are in this for the long haul. I hope we will also be agreed on the fact that we here in Bangladesh will have a commitment of that burden-sharing notion being developed sooner rather than later on a global plane, and that this international conference and the Dhaka Declaration that will be adopted at the end of the day today will reflect that sense of urgency, or that plea of urgency. In the meantime, I would also submit that there will not be any quick fixes. The process of durable, sustainable solutions, by their very term and definition, will be slow and painstaking. But there will be two ways to go about it. One is an external pressure, moral, legal, and political, to come to bear upon Myanmar. The other process will be to empower, sensitizing forces from within Myanmar, for changes from within. That makes the process more sustainable. And this is, again, that has come across in a presentation happily in this session. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are the tools that the panelists, the distinguished panelists of this session, and I leave you with to work on and build on, and to sort of deliberate upon and see how best we may pick and choose from these tools, these legal tools, and help develop a quick response, a sustainable response to the plight of these hapless Rohingya refugees. Thank you so much for your time and patience. And thank you to all the panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, duty calls. I have to go back to court. One of the co-conveners, Mr. Imtiaz Ahmed, has very graciously agreed to oversee the Q&A session from here onwards. I take your leave, and I wish you all the luck with today's, the rest of the deliberations today. Thank you so much. What an honor, sir. I might see you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The floor is open. If you have questions and comments, who wants to go first? Yes, please.
I think the reason everyone was hesitant to take their hand up is because Justice Ishtiaq wrapped it up so effectively. My name is Manzoor Malik. I'm a researcher for the labor movement. I work for a union in Toronto, and I'm here more as an observer and in respect of global solidarity work that we do. One of the I first have to I applaud all the speakers. They really spoke well in terms of the work that they do and the work that they're passionate about. And I want to particularly thank Tapan Bose for actually mentioning the word genocide. It's a slow-burning genocide indeed, and it has to be acknowledged. Simultaneously, what needs to be acknowledged is the underlying framework that permeates the broader geopolitical situation that's happening, and Tapan Bose did touch on it, but it needs to be elaborated a bit further and needs to be understood that the idea of the welfare state that came about post-Second World War is currently under threat in the West. And democracy as we know it, I mean, democracy on a sociological aspect is an ideal. It always aspires to achieve it. It never does. But electoral democracy is not what real democracy is about. So Myanmar has supposedly had that electoral democracy. Sanctions went away. Suu Kyi got her position. And right now, I mean, as you mentioned, Great Britain, as well as Australia and other countries have military training happening. And simultaneously, multinational corporations' investment have not ceased, but rather increased even post-September of last year. And until or unless we actually acknowledge these underlying issues and causes that lead to such crisis, The fear is such crisis will become the norm in the coming decades. We need to create a more democratic, not only institutions, but an ideal that is part of our population. I mean, Tapan Bose did mention the positive aspects of Indian legal framework, but forgot to mention that how in terms of corporate expansions, indigenous populations of different parts in India have been uprooted from their homes that have been there for a very long time. So I think the critique has to happen at home as well as abroad, and a push for massive levels of sanctions is needed. In the case of what has happened in South Africa in the 80s, and the push that has happened for the boycott, divestment, sanctions for BDS movement in terms of Israel, which it's fundamentally opposed to. So anyways, I'll leave with that thought, and I hope that we create a more social democratic ideals in this part of our world, because right now what has happened is all the policies that have come out of all these states have been very market driven, and where people come way back, it's all about generating profit. I think that critique needs to be at the forefront. Thank you.
Next, we can take one or two more. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Imtiaz. I'm Mahfuzul Haq. I'm a former secretary of the government, and I also teach in various universities. Well, I was just wondering, this refugee convention, and as we understand, Bangladesh didn't sign this convention, along with the South Asian countries as well. Had we been a party to this convention, we could have given some legal support or whatever it is, I mean, some logistics, etc. We could have given, or the refugee, they could have asked for those facilities had we been a party to this convention. Now, what is the present status from the legal point of view? Because we are not a party to this convention, and the refugee and the Rohingya, as we understand, we call them refugee here. I see that. So they have been thrust on us. So how we are dealing with them? Intruder, and then confined in some ghettos, in some camps. As we understand, yesterday also, we have been taking them to Vashanchor in another camp. So would they be living in camps? And how we are accommodating ourselves with this convention, since we are not a party to this convention? Could I make my point clear? Thanks so much.
Let's take one more, and then we'll request the panelists to respond. Is there any hand, any burning question? No. Okay, Taslima.
Thank you for the pertinent question on the ratification of the 1951 convention that you were just mentioning. If you look into, when we're talking about a mass influx of refugees, then it's even if we have signed the convention, if you look into the scholarly debates on the protection, the temporary protection in terms of mass influx of refugees, it always remains on the paper to actually ensure those rights, especially when we're talking about millions of refugees at one time. So detaining in one particular area and curbing the right of freedom of movement, although we would like to put it in words on paper, but thinking of the practicalities of it, worldwide, whenever there is a refugee influx in such large level, it has been the case that some limitations to these rights that has been there in the convention had been curbed with the global approval. And even if we haven't signed the convention, we are actually bound by certain, of course, fundamental human rights norms that I think all the organizations that are working in the camps are trying to at least ensure those minimum standards, even if we are not signatory state to the 1951 Convention, because we are bound by the principle of non-refoulement, we can't push them back, we are bound by the international human rights norms, so those are still regulating. So it's not that we're totally out of international norms, but then maybe ratification of a 1951 convention at this stage, maybe the practical situation would not have been changed, even if we had been, a signatory to 1951 convention. That's what I think.
Jessica, you have something to say? No. Okay.
I would add that, there are historic reasons why India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh have not ratified the 1951 convention or the 67 protocol. Well, I agree with the rationale for not having done so, but I have not been able to understand why these countries have not enacted a refugee law, their own national law, and this law could have been harmonized through the effort of SARC so that there could be a protection regime for refugees in all these countries. And that, I think, is an area where we really need to work on. As a part of the South Asia Forum, we worked on it. We had an eminent persons committee with Kamal Saab from here, Justice Durab Patel, Justice, one of our former Chief Justices in India. We pushed for it. So the whole attempt to create a regional refugee regime, which Africa has under OAU, which the OAS has, which Europe today has, we don't have in our region. These are two things that I think we need to push for, so that there is a more transparent way of dealing with people who come seeking asylum. Nobody comes seeking asylum for fun, Nobody leaves their home and hearth for, frivolous reasons. So there has to be some kind, because right now it's all ad hoc. I mean, what is happening in Cox's Bazar, it's all decisions being taken day to day, as the Foreign Secretary also told us. And that has been happening in India, that has been happening. 5 lakhs of Sri Lankan refugees India dealt with exactly in the same manner. And no matter how much generous you may be, because when you don't have a policy, you don't have laws, you don't have norms which are established in the country as a part of our legal regime, then the whole treatment is always very ad hoc. So that's something that I think we need to do. Even if we have not signed the convention, in the ICCPR, in the Convention for Social, Economic and Cultural Rights, in CEDAW, in Child Rights Convention, there are provisions which bind us almost, in many ways to look after refugees, whether the children, the women, and the principle of non-refoulement is part of the customary international law. So we can't throw people out. So what Bangladesh has done is, followed the international norms without having been a signatory to the convention, and I think that is correct. And it has done, in fact, more than generous. On the debate whether we should or we should not, I think that's a much larger debate. I would think we need to debate whether we should have a national law, and that national law finally leading to a regional mechanism. I think that is an area we need to work on. Thank you.
Yes, Jessica.
I won't comment on the legal dimensions, but I did want to comment that this crisis doesn't exist in a vacuum for Myanmar. We've had a refugee displacement to the Thai-Burma border for a long time, and I think it would be worth examining what happened in Thailand in terms of policy, but also in terms of the space that was given to communities there. Because over time, things fell into place where there were opportunities for refugees and refugee youth to pursue education opportunities, mobilize, develop civil society networks. And although the context isn't the same, it's worth noting that when Myanmar began to open up, a lot of those networks were able to move back inside and participate in the peace process, which we can't say is successful, but we can see that in current state, for example, now, things are much better than they were 10 or 15 years ago, and to an extent there's been a bit of repatriation, whether formal or informal. And moreover, the stage is still kind of being set, and those civil society leaders that emerged and became capacitated when they were in Thailand are leading a process that many people still hope will lead to greater return and resettlement in the future. So it'd be worth noting what happened in the Thai context that maybe Bangladesh could think about as well.
Well, thank you very much on behalf of Justice Rifat and all of you. You want to say something now? Okay, please, can't we wait for the next session? Can we wait? We are already...
It is, yes, okay.
Yeah, we wait. Thank you very much, all of you. I think we can continue this debate that we have started. 10 minutes break for tea, and we come back. Thank you very much.
आज शांति न वो तुम्हारी थी बोला कि आने वाली है दादी ना खाई उसने सीधे फोन मारी गला ये पानी हाँ भाजी रे पानी पानी है क्या एक पानी हवा पानी हवा हाँ भाजी
गर्भुरा जीवले
तुम्हारा अब्बा माँ क्यों नहीं
नहीं
tu pode virar de vai dia bicho manos khadi wala ye बहुत आगे सोच सम्मान हो रही है
आज कैसे ना हाय बिना लगते ना हाय ना हाय तो फांसी दा से ले 11 दिन लगे आरा तो आते बिशो हस्ट करी अछि जारा तो फोन ले रहनो डला फरानो लालो जोरी आज जो तेरी बिची दुगुरी अछि.
We have a young mother here who has just given birth to her baby son yesterday. She has 6 children in total now, including this newborn child. The camps have identified young mothers and pregnant women and put up yellow flags over the tents, but no support is yet to be deployed to the pregnant mothers and for newborn babies.
are right in the middle of Balukhali camp. People don't have latrine, there's no wash, sanitation. So I cannot describe the dire need here. They don't know what the future is. They don't know what tomorrow is. All they're trying to do is survive.